We start with the first passage. It's about bureaucracy. And look at the first sentence, what he says here. Around the world, capital cities are disgorging bureaucrats. Now, what do you mean by disgorging bureaucrats? Obviously, in the post-colonial fervor of the 20th century. That's a little thing. But the first one, disgorging bureaucrats, that is, they are throwing out bureaucrats. Now, what do you mean by throwing out? It means, well, they are being posted, you see, at remote places. They are not allowed to be in a cluster, something of that kind. Given remote posting, you see. In the post colonial fervor of the 20th century, postal capital picked by trade focused empires were spurned for regionally neutral ones. But decamping wholesale is costly and unpopular governments these days prefer piecemeal dispersal. Now, the point is when once upon a time, you see, when it was what you call a colonial system. A colonial system means that is when perhaps the British ruled over India, that was the colonial era. And the post colonial era would be after we got independence. Now, you see, in the post colonial fervor of the 20th century, coastal capitals picked by trade focused empires were spurned for regionally neutral one. The point is, it suits whether it is the colonial time or the post colonial time, the requirements of trade, the requirements of business, the requirements, the coastal capitals which are near the coast. You see, the question is, was the convenience of the colonial or the post colonial government, you see, whether how to distribute the services of these bureaucrats. The trend reflects how the world has changed. In past eras, when information traveled at a snail's pace, civil servants had to cluster together. Look, now what does he say here? The past eras, when information, you see, could not be easily exchanged or could not be speedily exchanged, you had these civil servants, you see, they were together. But now desk workers can ping emails and video chat around the world. Travel for face-to-face meetings may be unavoidable, but transport links to have. So now things have improved now, right? About the posting of the bureaucrats, things have improved. Now we'll just quickly go to the main points in the second paragraph, where he talks about the benefits, you see, of being in the outbacks. You can see for yourself. He says proponents of moving civil servants around promise countless benefit. It disperses the risk that a terrorist attack of natural disaster will cripple an entire government. Yes, if you have bureaucrats posted, you see, in remote places and in distant places, there's already a chance, you see, that the government might be saved if there's a terrorist attack. Now, what he means to say is, I'll just give you an example. In any government, in any country, there is a secretariat. And in that secretariat, if you have all the bureaucrats, and if the secretariat, you see, has a terrorist attack, then you see the government loses all its bureaucrats. But then if the bureaucrats were to be posted, you see, at different places, they might be saved and the government might be saved. Okay. Wonks in the sticks will be inspired by new ideas. You know, what do you mean by wonks? Wonks are people, you see, who subscribe to a particular faith or a particular belief. And they are very steadfast upon that. They are wonk. You call them wonky or wonk. Wonks in the sticks. What do you mean by in the sticks? That is, people, wonks, people who are, you see, in the outbacks, in the rural areas, faraway places, away from the city, will be inspired by new ideas that world of capitals cannot conjure up. Autonomous regulators perform best far from the pressure and lobbying of the big city. Yes, autonomous regulators, that is, if the bureaucrats are placed, you see, far away, they can do their service much better. Their services are much better than being clustered together at one place. You must try to understand the point. When they are clustered together, there's a lot of problem about hierarchy, about ranking, right? They cannot work independently because they have a senior bureaucrat over them, and a senior bureaucrat will have another senior bureaucrat above him. So they can't work independently. But once they are posted outside, you see, they have a chance to prove their mettle, their talent. Okay. Some even hail a cure for ascendant cynicism and populism. The unloved bureaucrats of faraway capitals will become as popular as firefighters once they mix with regular folk. Okay. Now, the thing is, the next point is he talks about why disperse these bureaucrats in the third paragraph. Dispersing central government functions usually has three specific aims to improve the lives of both civil servants and those living in plot cap. That is the first aim, to disperse them, to save money. That is the second aim, to redress regional imbalances. That is the third aim. These are the three aims behind dispersing or behind posting central government officials, you see, at different places. The trouble is that these goals are not always realized. But then, I mean, even if you have this aim improving the lives of the civil servants and the common man, and even if you have the aim of the government has the aim of saving money and to rectify regional imbalances, even if they have these three aims, they are not realized for several reasons. Second distinct point he makes here is about what he call it has a long pedigree. After the Second World War, Britain moved thousands of civil servants to agreeable English country towns as London was rebuilt. Now, he's talking about what you call improving living conditions. But then somewhere or the other, you see, instead of improving those conditions, sometimes those conditions worsen. Now, the second reason to pack bureaucrats off is to save money. Office space costs far more in capital. So if you move them in places other than the capitals, you see they might what you call possibly save money. And the third reason in the next paragraph he talks about is to rebalance regional inequality. That is to bring about equality, you see, if there are imbalance. Now there are certain things involved here if you read this paragraph. And you can see sometimes the aim is to fulfill the potential of a country's second tier cities. Unlike poor remote places, bigger cities can make the most of relocated government agencies, right? And then in the next paragraph, he talks about the dilemma. And the dilemma is obvious. Pick small, poor towns in areas of high unemployment, get new jobs, but it is hard to attract the most qualified workers. Yes, that is a dilemma. You can pick up small towns, poor towns, where the rate of unemployment is high. But then the point is, there you don't get qualified work. And then you opt for larger cities with infrastructure and better qualified residents, and the country's most deprived areas see little benefit. A dilemma, you see. If you go for the outbacks of the city, the rural areas, the suburban areas, the small towns, you see that you don't get what you call qualified people. But then if you opt for larger cities with infrastructure and better qualified residents, you see, then what happens is those people who are living in smaller cities, you see, they don't get them. So now others contend that decentralization begets corruption by making government species agencies less accountable. So now you can understand in the last paragraph what he has been talking about till now: dispersal of duties, dispersal of what you call discharging of duties in different places, the transfer posting of bureaucrats. He is talking about decentralization, not to centralize everything, but decentralization. It brings corruption, and what happens is it makes what you call the government less responsible. So you can see for yourself now. He's talking about the advantages of decentralization and the benefits, you see, of decentralization. And within that decentralization is couched the very idea, you see, of dispersal and discharge of duties. And that is why he begins by saying that the capital cities are disgorging bureaucrats. I think that's clear. We take the first question. According to the passage, colonial powers located their capitals, and you have that in the very first paragraph, the second two lines: the trade-focused empires. Right. So to showcase their power and prestige, no, it was not that. When you colonize a country by choosing a particular capital, you're not doing that. In fact, you want to make use of their resources to show your power. Where they had the densest population, no. Based on political expediency, it could be an answer based on political, in the sense, if you're talking if the passage talks about, but the passage doesn't talk about political expediency. Okay, the passage talks about what you call to promote their trading interest, right? The dilemma mentioned in the passage refers to, now what is the dilemma? So if you look at the number one, keeping government agencies in the largest city with good infrastructure or moving them to a remote area with few amenities. Now that is not a dilemma. That is not a dilemma. That is a choice. A dilemma involves, you see, a difficult choice. The second one, concentrating on decongesting large cities or focusing on boosting employment in relatively larger cities. Now, these are not dilemmas. These are not dilemmas, you see, that if you want to decongest the cities or you want to focus on boosting employment, this is a part of the government. Third one is encouraging private enterprises to relocate to smaller towns or not incentivizing them in order to keep the government costs in those towns low. Now, that could be a policy, but that is not a dilemma, you see. If they encourage, you see, the private enterprises to go to the smaller towns, or if they choose not to incentivize them in order to keep the government cost, you see, at an all-time low, that cannot be a dilemma. The dilemma is in number four, the relocating government agencies to boost growth in remote areas with poor eminent or to relatively larger cities with good. Now that is a dilemma. If the government decides to boost growth in what you call cities with poor facility, or they move to larger cities with good aim. But then what happens is he has already talked about this in the passage, and he says that if they go to the larger cities, he cites the example of a journalist, and he says that they become less responsive. The focus is more or less decentralized. So the correct answer is number 4. The next question: people who support decentralizing central government functions are least likely to cite which of the following reasons for their view. There are two things that you have to keep in mind when you answer a question like this. Number one, you find people who support decentralizing central government functions. Number two, least likely to cite which of the following. So the least likely statement here is it could weaken the nexus between bureaucrats and media in the cap. They would not cite such a reason, those who support decentralization. You have the other ones: more independence could be enjoyed by regulatory bodies located away from political centers. He talks about that there. Okay, policymakers may benefit from fresh thinking in a new environment. It reduces expenses as infrastructure costs and salaries are lower in small states. Talks about saving money there. But this is the answer number 4, that it could possibly weaken the nexus, the connection between the bureaucrats and the media and the capital if you give such an argument. The next one is the long pedigree of the aim to shift civil servants to improve their living standard implies that this move. You have this sentence here, fourth paragraph. The first aim, improving living conditions, has a long pedigree. After the Second World War and so forth, he talks about it. He says, well, the answer should be that it implies it's not a new idea and has been tried in the past. That is what it implies. A long pedigree means it has been coming down the edges. It has been coming down the edges. That is the implication. If you say it is a long pedigree, that it has been handed over down from the past. So number 1 is the correct. Number 2 cannot be, has become common practice in several countries worldwide. That is, I mean, it doesn't mean that. It's supported by politicians and ruling elites. No, takes a long time to achieve its intended outcomes. No, that's not the reason. The next question, according to the author, relocating government agencies has not always been success for all of the following reasons except. Okay, relocating government agencies has not always been a success. So the 3 reasons: the difficulty of attracting talented, well-skilled people in remote areas, he has already talked about that. The difficulty of attracting talented people. Increased avenues of corruption away from the capital city. High staff losses as people may not be prepared to move to smaller towns. So relocating has been always far from success, not been successful for the following reason: that they don't get talented people, corruption is there, high staff losses. I mean, one which has to be accepted is a rise in pollution levels and congestion in the new locations. He doesn't talk about that in the past. This has not been mentioned in the passage. So the answer is number 1. Now we come to the next passage, and that is preservation. In general, I'll just give you an idea what is he talking about. He is talking about those archaeological and precious cultural sites, you see, which may have been damaged, might have been damaged in the past, or which may be damaged in future, or which are being damaged due to war or some other. Now he talks about something known as the digital colonialism. That is, Google has, you see, appropriated the right to scan all these cultural sites. He says such an approach is a digital colonialism. Others don't get the rights to do so. And at some places, Google has been so active. If you go through the passage, if it points out that in some places, the countries you see which you see own those cultural heritages or archaeological heritages, you see, they don't have what you call a copy of that digital scanning, which Google owns. Now, in such a situation, this is what you call encouraging a kind of colonialism, a kind of domination, you see, over the other countries and their cultural heritages. Now, that is the what you call the germ of the entire paragraph here. The same idea is expanded, you see, in the paragraphs that are given here. The first line word talks about, the paragraph talks about the destruction of world's most precious cultural sites. war can do that, natural disasters can do that, climate change can do. Google is trying to help preserve these archaeological wonders by allowing users access to 3D images of these treasures through its site. But the project is raising questions about Google's motivations and about who should own the digital, what you call, copyright. Now, that is the point here. This is known as a digital colonialism. A digital colonialism would mean that Google has got, you see, specifically all the right to scan and own the photograph, the outlines, the motifs, the design of these cultural and heritage sites exclusively. No other site, you see, possibly might be entrusted with this work. So he's talking about that in number 2, and in number 3 he gives you an example when it comes about the archaeological treasures. The losses have been mounting, right? And he gives you example of what was damaged in what you call Bagan in the ancient city of Myanmar, or the other places in Syria. Now, he expands, you see, upon that idea when he talks about Bagan in the 3rd paragraph, and says that Google has literally scanned, you see, all those things. It has digital renditions of the whole thing. So that has become a domination over the country, you see, which owns all these things. Now, the next thing is he talks about the images of the temples in Bagan are part of a collaboration with this company, you see, SciArc, a non-profit that creates the 3D scanning of historic sites. And Google, you see, rather very modestly claims that it is not making money out of these sites. In fact, out of this scanning or 3D images, it's in fact, you see, serving people and just disseminating information to all of them. That is what the plea of Google is. But then in this passage, the writer seems to be what he calls not in agreement with what Google says. He feels that this is a kind of digital colonialism, and it cannot be as simple as the saying of Google that it's only disseminating information to people. It cannot be as simple as that. It's not as simple as that. In the next paragraph, he says critics say the collaboration could be an attempt by a large corporation to wrap itself in the sheen of culture. And then he talks about the archaeologist, Professor Waterall at Michigan State University. And he says he's not comfortable with the arrangement between SciArc and Google. And why isn't he? Because he says that by giving Google the rights to digitally scan all these things, or to hold these things, you see, in the digital, what you call, museum, obviously this is a hidden agenda to promote Google. But its core, it's all about advertisements and driving traffic. Waterall says these images belong to the site of a museum or educational institution where there is serious scholarship and a very different mission. That is a point that Professor Waterall doesn't touch very greatly. The next paragraph, there's another issue for some of the archaeologists and art historians. And what is that? You say SciArc owns the copyrights of the scan, not the countries where these sites are located. That means the countries need SciArc's permission to use these images for commercial purposes. That is the idea of patenting. You see, once something is digitized, it's scanned, it's held in the museum, then it is patented. Now, the country which owns all these cultural heritage and cultural sites, you see, or archaeological heritage, you see, it might seek, it's very absurd that the country which owns all these things, it has to seek permission from Google or SciArc to make use of those scans. Now, how can that be a point in favor of that particular country? And that is how, you see, they don't like this. Aaron Thompson, a professor of crime at John Gay College of Criminal Justice in New York City, says it's the latest example of a Western nation appropriating a foreign culture a centuries long back. So they are all talking about what he called colonialism, the dominance of Google, the colonialism of Google. SciArc says it copyrights the scans so no one can use them in an inappropriate way. Now, who is SciArc to decide? That is a basic question that Professor Thompson is raising. Who is SciArc to decide, or Google to decide that, well, this scan won't be misused or won't be misappropriated? It belongs, I mean, those cultural sites and heritage, they belong to a particular country. The country should come forward. It has the right, you see, it has the responsibility to allow people to use them or not use them. Why should SciArc or Google, you see, come in the way? That is the point, you see, Professor Thompson raises here. So the company says it works closely with authorities during the process, even training local people to help. But critics like Thompson are persuaded she would prefer the scans to be owned by the countries and people where these sites are located. Obviously, that's the point, you see, that Professor Thompson is trying to make. And the passage in toto or in entirety is talking about this particular point. I think that's quite clear now. We move on to what you call the questions. First one, based on his views mentioned in the passage, one could best characterize Dr. Watrall as being what? As being opposed to the use of digital technology in archaeological and cultural sites in developing countries? No. He doesn't say that. Dismissive of lay people's access to specialist images? No. Uneasy about the marketing of archaeological images for commercial use? These points haven't been touched upon in the past. It's the last one. Critical about the links between a non-profit and a commercial tech platform for distributing archaeological images. That is the correct answer, number 4. The next question. By digital colonialism, critics of SIAC Google project are referring to the fact that, now what is digital colonialism? I explained to you the whole thing. What do you mean by that? Okay, look at the first one. SIAC and Google have been scanning images without copyright permission from host countries. That is a practice in digital colonialism. They don't seek permission. They just boss over the other countries. The scanning process can damage delicate frescoes and statues of the sites. That's not a point raised in the past. Countries where the scanned sites are located do not own the scanned copyrights. That is obviously, I pointed out, this is digital colonialism. The cultural heritages, the archaeological heritages, the archaeological sites you see, which belong to a particular country. And if those sites have been scanned, copies have been made, I mean, they should belong to that particular country. I mean, how can you see Google and SIAC claim, well, it is now their copyright and their, what you call, colonial right to do that? That is the point he's trying to make here. So the answer here is number 3, countries where the scanned sites are located do not own the scanned copyright. And the last one is incorrect. SIAC and Google have not shared the details of this with the host country. Now we come to the next question. Which of the following, if true, would most strongly invalidate Dr. Watrall's objection? If you look at the passage and 6th paragraph, he's talking about Ethan Watrall, an archaeologist, the professor at the Michigan State University. He has pointed out what Dr. Watrall has. What has he said? He says, Watrall says this project is just a way to promote, you see, Google. Yes. Now, which of the following, if true, would most strongly invalidate? That is, possibly, you see, draw the air out of the argument, you see, Dr. Watrall's argument. So let us look at the options here. And he says here that Google takes down advertisements on its website. Number 1, that's not the correct one. There is a ban on SIAC scanning. That's not what they don't talk about the ban in the past. SIAC does not own the copyright on scanned images of archaeological sites. And then you have SIAC uploads its scanned images of archaeological sites onto museum websites only. That is incorrect. If they were to do that, then possibly, you see, the argument would have been validated. But it is invalidated by this statement, you see. The argument. And what is the argument of Dr. Watrall? The argument is that they are promoting Google. And if they were if they were to upload all these things, the digitized scans you see into the museum website, it would be a difference. They aren't doing that. They have the patent rights for it. The correct answer is number 4. Now let's look at the next question. In Dr. Thompson's view, SIAC owning the copyright of its digital scans of archaeological sites is akin to what? He says this is akin to the seizing of ancient Egyptian artifacts by a Western museum. That is number 2. Number 2 is the correct answer. You can see that in the first line of the last paragraph. Says it is the latest example of a Western nation appropriating a foreign culture a centuries long back, right? So number 2 is the correct answer. Now let us look at the next question. Of the following arguments, which one is least likely to be used by the companies that digitally scan cultural sites? It enables people who cannot physically visit these sites to experience. No, they don't use this argument. It helps preserve precious images in case the sites are damaged or destroyed. No, it allows a large corporation to project itself as a protector of culture. That's correct. Number 3 is the answer. It provides images free of cost to all you. Why did I say 3 is correct? Because the entire passage is talking about what? Digital colonial. Now, if this digital colonialism were to be encouraged, what would happen is it would allow a large corporation to project itself as a protector of culture. So they would not use this argument. They would say, no, we aren't the protector of your culture. In fact, we are just enabling people who cannot physically visit these sites to experience, or we are just preserving, you see, your images before they are damaged or destroyed. Or you say that we are providing these scanned images free of. They won't say, they are least likely to say that, well, we are in fact a protector of culture. We are going to dominate over you. So number 3 is the correct answer. Now let's move on to the next passage, urban settlement. Now in this particular passage, you see, he's talking about the squatters, the rat pickers in the city, those people who are living in the slum where a lot of rat pickers are there, and those rubbish is recycled, living in shanties, living in shacks and slums. And he further talks about what are the advantages of people being squeezed into a slum. And then the next point he takes up is about how we could possibly stop deforestation with the help of squeezing in more and more people, you see, on a smaller piece of land or space. That is what he's talking about here. And that is why in the very first sentence he says the magic of squatter cities is that they are improved steadily and gradually by their residents. And to any planner, you see, they might look confusing. They might look chaotic. But the writer says that he is trained as a biologist and he finds them very organic. He finds them very green, and they have the maximum of density, 1 million people per square mile in some areas of Mumbai, and have minimum energy and material use. Why? People get around by foot, bicycle, rickshaw, of the universal shared tech. Now look at the argument. It might sound a little ironical. It might even sound a little humorous. He says people living in slum, that's a very high density. I mean, what is that? 1 million people per square mile in some areas of Bombay. Now these people contribute a lot to the saving of energy, to the saving of petrol, to the saving of what you call material things. How? Because most of the time they are on foot, or they are using bicycles or rickshaws or shared taxi, the people living in slums. So they contribute a great deal. And since they live in a limited space, limited room, there's a lot of space for forestation. You can grow trees. And that is why he says squatter cities are also unexpectedly green. In the second paragraph, he is talking about the Brazilian favelas. The favelas are slums. In Brazil, they call that favela. And he says where electricity is stolen and therefore free. People leave their lights on all day. But in most slums, recycling is literally a way of life. That is how they do that. You see a lot of recycling going on in Dharavi slum in Mumbai. It has 400 recycling units and 30,000 rack pickers. So you can imagine 6,000 tons of rubbish are sorted every day. And you can understand that they are contributing a great deal to the cleanliness of the city, you see. Again, then in the third paragraph, he's talking about an article and the advantages, you see, of slums. What are the advantages of being living in a compact place? And I'll just read out a line. It will be clear to you in the next paragraph. He says the concentration of population and enterprises in urban areas greatly reduces the unit cost of pipe water, sewers, drains, roads, electricity, garbage collection, transport, health care. People living in slums, you see, they make lesser use of these things than what is done by people living in big places. And then in the next paragraph, he talks about how to stop deforestation and give people decent jobs. If people are concentrated in smaller places, there would be more space for more room for trees to grow. And that is the point he's taking up. The last paragraph, he says, if you look at this sentence, the progress is from hick to metropolitan to cosmopolitan. You see that the point is from hick means from the parochial limits, the narrow limits, you see, of the village or the suburban area to the metropolitan or the coast. The last paragraph where it says, of course, fast-growing cities are far from an unmitigated good. They concentrate crime, pollution, disease, injustice as much as business, innovation, education, and entertainment. And but if they are overall a net good for those who move there, it is because cities offer more than just jobs. They are transformative in the slums as well as the office towers and leafy suburbs. The progress is from hick to metropolitan. So I think that's clear now. We can move on to the questions now. Which one of the following statements would undermine the author's stand regarding the greenness of weaken the argument? Because what he argued was basically that if you have a higher concentration of people on a smaller piece of land, you have a greater land available for forestation or growing trees or for greenery. Now, if this statement, this argument would be undermined by one of these statements here, and that statement is number 3. The high density of cities leads to an increase in carbon dioxide and global warming. I mean, the moment you say that high density in cities you see will increase carbon dioxide and global warming, then the argument that he is giving that high density would lead to more greenery would be undermined. So that is why number 3 is the correct answer. Let us look at the next question. According to the passage, squatter cities are environment friendly for all of the reasons except their transportation is energy efficient. He has pointed that out in the very first paragraph. They recycle material, that's also correct. They sort out garbage, that's also correct. Their streets are kept clean, that is incorrect. That is accepted. So the answer is number 4. The next question, we can infer that Calthorpe's statement still jars with most people because that is they get irritated. They don't like that argument. Why? Because the answer is they do not consider cities to be eco-friendly places. See, what is the argument that Calthorpe makes in the 3rd paragraph? The city is the most environmentally benign form of human settlement. Each city dweller consumes less land, less energy, less water, and produces less pollution than its counterpart in settlements of lower density. So the answer should be number 2. Now let us look at the next question. In the context of the passage, the author refers to Manaus in order to explain how urban areas help the environment. You have that in the last but one paragraph. 100,000 people who would otherwise be deforesting the jungle around Manaus are now prospering in town, making such things as mobile phones and television. So the answer should be number 1. The other 3 cannot be the answer. Describe the infrastructure efficiencies of living in a city. He doesn't talk about it. Explain where cities source their labor for facts. Not mentioned there. Promote cities as employment hubs for people. No, that's not the point. The answer is number 1. Now the next question is, from the passage it can be inferred that cities are good places to live in for all of the following reasons, except that they have suburban areas as well as office. Number 4 is an exception. Number 1, they offer employment opportunities. It can be inferred that cities are good places to live in for the following reason. They help prevent destruction of the environment, contribute to the cultural transformation of residents. But to say that they have suburban areas as well as office areas, that is what we call something meretricious, superficial, right? So number 4 is the correct answer. Now, let us look at the next passage. It's about, he says, linguistics. Linguistics is the study of language. What he says here is, what is the effect on the language you speak when you sell a particular thing? He says the Chinese who have possibly entered Egypt, they are selling, you see, lingerie. This is lingerie. And lingerie is sold to women because it is basically what you call women's clothing, undergarment. So now what he argues here is these Chinese dealers, you see, or retailers, in the practice of selling this lingerie to women customers, they have started, in fact, you see, imitating women in their speech. The point is the effect on the language. When you sell a particular thing to particular persons, you sometimes come back with such an effect. So that is what he is talking about in the entire paragraph. And you have the point here, the objections to his theory, you see, in the last line. I have come to think of it as a lingerie dialect And there's something disarming about these Chinese men speaking in the feminine voice. You see, that is the theory he has developed. Now, there have been objections to these theories, you see, and one of the journalists, a reporter, this piece is so Orientalist, I don't know what to do. A reporter who worked at The Guardian tweeted. Another colleague at the British paper, Imam Amrani, agreed. I wouldn't have minded an article on the subject written by an Egyptian woman. Probably would have had better insight. This writer says, I am a man of language. And I also take issue with this kind of essentialism, right? And then he talks about this kind of imitation, this kind of learning that goes on in this paragraph. Finally, he comes to what he calls the identity politics and identity linguistics in the last paragraph. You say you are what you speak. The words that run throughout your mind are at least as fundamental to your selfhood as your ethnicity or your gender. I hope now, if you go through the passage, it will be clear to you what he is talking about. When he is talking about essentialism, he is actually talking about the essential characteristic of a person. You see, all of us are recognized by some kind of essential characteristic, essential trait in us. So the point that he makes here is the impact, you see, on language of the item that you're selling, the way you sell it, and what is the impact you see of that on your language. So now we can come to the questions. Which of the following can be inferred from the author's claim? Which way is oriented? The answer to this is learning another language can mitigate cultural hierarchies. And you see, the question that was raised, I think, in one of the paragraphs, he says, which way is oriental? That is second last paragraph. The point that he makes here is, this is a reply to the second paragraph. This piece is so Orientalist. I don't know what to do. Aisha Ghani, a reporter who worked at The Guardian, tweeted. So he says, which of the following can be inferred from the author's claim? So you can infer learning another language can mitigate cultural hierarchies. And if you learn another language, say if you're in Egypt, if you learn Egyptian, if you're in China, you learn Chinese, then it could possibly lessen, you see, cultural hierarchies and barriers. So that is number one is the correct answer. And globalization has a mitigated cultural hierarchies. That is not the answer. It's all about language. Goodwill alone mitigates cultural hierarchies. No. Orientalism is a discourse of the past from colonial time, rarely visible today. That is untrue, right? In fact, Orientalism, you see, is something which is being talked about these days. It's not a thing of the past. The next question, a French ethnographer decides to study the culture of a Nigerian tribe. Which of the following is most likely to be the view of the author of the passage? The author would encourage the ethnographer but ask her to first learn the language of the Nigerian tribe. That is what the author would do, because this passage is about linguistics and the emphasis is about learning that language in which you want to do research, right? Or in you want to understand something. So number one is the correct answer. Others, you see, are not correct. He says he would encourage the ethnographer but ask him to be mindful of his racial and gender identity. No. From conducting the study, as Nigerian ethnographers can better understand the tribe. No. And recommend him to hire a good translator for the purpose of holding. These things are not taken up in the past. In fact, what he is talking about is, if he encourages, you see, that you learn that particular language, and if you do that, you'll do much better instead of what you call going for anything else. The next question, the author's critics would argue that language is insufficient to bridge cultural barriers. In fact, the author, you see, argues that language is sufficient to bridge cultural barriers and hierarchies. We just saw that in the previous question, that language can mitigate cultural hierarchies and barriers. That is what the author is talking about. But the author's critics, you see, they would say, well, language is... Why would they say that? They would say that because they are more interested in the identity politics and the linguistics identity. Answer is number two. And the last question he says here, according to the passage, which one of the following is not responsible for language's ability to change us? The ups and downs involved in the course of learning a language, that cannot be the answer. Language's intrinsic connection to our notions of self and identity, that cannot be, because somewhere in the back of the mind, all of us have some kind of connections to our notion and self-identity linked to language's ability to mediate the impact of identity markers one is born with. The answer should be the last one, the twists and turns in the evolution of language over time. That is the correct answer. Number four is the correct answer. British colonial policy. If you go through the passage, you will see that he's talking about the British imperialist policies, the British colonial policies. Colonial, that is because they made colonies of countries where they entered and ruled and traded, right? Like India was made into a colony, right? It was colonized by the British. So the British, what do you call, he says in the first paragraph that the British colonial policy went through two policy phases, or he says at least two strategies, between which you see its policies oscillated. That is, it was suspended use, and sometimes it was to the advantage of the British. The point that he's trying to make here is there were two things. That is, the policy was a mix of what you call military power and a clever diplomacy. These were two things, you see, between which the imperialist power generally zoomed in order to win over the colony and the people of the colony. And they were very cautious about that. And in the first paragraph, see, what they thought was they were an arrogant sort of people, the British. And when they entered India, or for that matter, whenever they entered any other country, you see, they were very much arrogant about their rule, about their power. And you see, it's a kind of white man's burden to educate the people, make the colony modern. They had a prejudice against all these colonies, a preconcept, you see, they had in their minds about India and other countries, and especially the Asian countries. You see that these people are not cultivated. These people are not educated. Something known as Enlightenment rationalism. They are not scientific in their outlook. So they talked about the white man's burden to educate these people, to rule over them and bring them under control and make them modern. Actually, you see, everything was utilitarian. What do you mean by utilitarian? That is, they had an axe to grind. That is, it was done for all their selfishness. They wanted to trade here, take all the material from here, all the resources from here, right, and send it to their own country. That was the game they were playing, but then they gave the label of the white man's burden in doing so. When you come to the second paragraph, you have modernity. And when he talks about modernity, you must remember one thing, that India wasn't modern at the time in the sense that we are talking today. And the Europeans, you see, the Englishmen decided to make India modern. And in doing so, they were actually imposing modernity not within, but without. That is, modernity was imposed externally upon the people of India. What do you mean by externally? That is, they had not won over the minds, the hearts of the people. Modernity was something which was imposed superficially from above, so that these people, they change themselves into the subaltern, or they become the subjects of the British. The thing is, and he talks about that, you see, at the beginning of the paragraph, he says the acceptance of modernity came to be connected ineradicably with subjection. Subjection means slavery. And this again points to two problems. One is theoretical, the other is political. And he says that theoretically, modernity was externally introduced, right? It was externally, it wasn't something, you see, within the masses. So, and in the last paragraph, he talks about the economic reforms and alterations. Some things, you see, about modernity was very good, but then all those things, you see, were in the interest of the British, not in the interest of the colonized country. I think the paragraph is quite clear now. We can now move over to the question. He says here at the beginning, all of the following statements about British colonialism can be inferred from the first paragraph except that. You see, there's an exception, that it was at least partly an outcome of Enlightenment rationalism. The British colonialism, you see, they justified it on the pretext of Enlightenment rationalism. It faced resistance from existing structural forms of Indian modernity. Look at the third one, was at least partly shaped by the project of European modernity. That you can infer. I just pointed out to you that they were justifying their rule all over the world, particularly Asia. They said it's a white man's burden, and they wanted to rule over all the people. Allowed the treatment of colonies as experimental sites. That's correct. So the correct answer is number 2, faced resistance from existing structural forms of Indian modernity. You see, if you look at the first paragraph, the last line, it was not the structural forms of Indian modernity, it was resisted by pre-existing structural forms. So you can't infer this from the British colonialism. So the answer is number 2. Now, let us look at the next question. He says all of the following statements, if true, could be seen as supporting the arguments in the passage except one state. Only one statement doesn't support it, and that is number 4. The change in British colonial policy was induced by resistance to modernity in Indian society. So that is not a point here. The point is the introduction of capitalism in India was not through the transformation of feudalism as happened in Europe. Now this is correct. Modernity was imposed upon India by the British and therefore led to underdevelopment. I told you it was an external affair. Throughout the history of colonial conquest, natives have often been experimented in by the colonizer. That is correct. They have been experimented, the original citizens. So number 4 is the exception. We come to the next question. Consequently, the colonial state could not settle simply for eminence as the cost of its marginality. It began to take initiatives to introduce the logic of modernity into Indian society. Which of the following best captures the sense of this statement? That is, in other words, you are looking for a statement which is synonymous with or which summarizes the statement that he has given in the question. So let us look at all the statements. Number 1, the colonial state's eminence was unsettled by its marginal position, therefore it developed Indian society by moderning. No, that is not the consequence. The consequence of India, you see, being modernized doesn't depend upon the marginality of the colonial state. No, the colonial enterprise was a costly one, so to justify the cost, it began to take initiatives to introduce the logic of modernity. No. Why was modernity introduced? The colonial state felt marginalized from Indian society because of its own modernity. There is the comparison. You see the comparative view. Therefore, it sought to address that marginalization by bringing its modernity to change Indian society. You see, that was the basic reason behind that. That is the answer. You see, what does he mean by that? In fact, you see, whenever there is a colonizer, whenever there is an imperialist power, it wants that all the natives, you see, over which it rules, get assimilated to in the mainstream of the colonial power. They want that so that there is no resistance, no revolt, and they stay in a state of subjection all the time. So the British wanted to adjust themselves. They might be fewer in number, but they were powerful, and they were in a position to what you call suppress the Indian citizens. Correct option is number 3. Now we come to the next question. Which one of the following 5-word sequences best captures the flow of arguments in the passage? Well, if you go paragraph wise, then you can see number 1 talks about colonial policy. And then he is talking about Enlightenment rationalism. The third thing he talks about is external modernity, and then subjection, and finally underdevelopment. If you look at the paragraphs carefully, you can get the answer, and the answer is number 2. The last question on the passage. Which of the following observations is a valid conclusion to draw from the author's statement that the logical structure of endogenous change does not apply here? Here, transformation agendas attack as an external force. You see, it's again a question where you have to understand this sentence, the logical structure of endogenous change does not apply here. And there's an attack, you see, as an external force. So if you look at the 4 options here, the last option is the correct one. The transformation of Indian society did not happen organically, but was forced by colonial agent. It was something external, and therefore number 4 is the correct answer. Now we come to question number 25. Now, so you have to look for some keywords, some clues. Look at this. Number 1, conceptualizations of women's time as contrary to clock time and clock time as synonymous with economic rationalism are 2 of the deleterious results of this representation. Now we don't know what representation he's talking about. He's using this representation. So we don't know. We must know first what is the representation about. And if you are talking about representation, then you have that word represented in number 4. Clock time has been consistently represented in feminine literature as a masculine artifact representative of a time is money person, right? So number 4 should come first, and then 4 should be followed by number 1. And after 1, you see, he's talking about conceptualization. And in number 3, the same idea is carried forward. The idea of conceptualization of women's time. Look at number 3. When the everyday practices of working soul fathers and working soul mothers are carefully examined to explore the conceptualizations of gendered time. It is found that carrying time is often more focused on the clock than generally theorized. So number 3 should follow, and then after 3 you have. So the answer is 4132. Now let's come to the next one. Living things, animals and plants typically exhibit co-relational structure. Okay, adaptive behavior depends on cognitive economy, treating objects as equivalent, the information we receive from our senses and so forth, and to categorize an object. You have a general statement here, and the general statement is in number 2. Adaptive behavior depends on cognitive economy, treating objects as equivalent. So number 2 should be the first set. And then the idea of equivalent is carried forward in number 4. To categorize an object means to consider it equivalent to other things in that category. He explains that. What does he mean when you say treating objects as equal? He says consider it equivalent to other things in that category and different along some salient dimension from other things that are. He explains that. So 2 should be followed by 4. And after 4, you have what you call the information we receive from our senses from the world, typically as structure and order, and is not arbitrary. So the point is, he's talking about a category, a categorization, which has a structure and order. So it should be 2, 4, 3, and then 1. That is the correct answer. Now let's look at the next cluster. To the uninitiated listener, atonal music can sound like chaotic random noise. Now this can be a general statement provided you understand what atonal music. But suppose the passage you see first tells out what atonal music is. So in that sense, one of the sentences speak out or spell out what is atonal music or what is a tonality, then 2 should be the first sentence. Number 2 explains a tonality is a condition of music in which the constructs of music do not live within the confines of a particular key signature scale of. Then after 2, you can have number 1. Because you can't have number 3 when you say after you realize the amount of knowledge, skill and technical expertise to compose and perform it. We are not aware what it refers to. After that, you have number 4. However, he's giving an argument. A tonality is one of the most important movements in the 20th century. Now, after you realize the amount of knowledge, skill, and technical expertise required to compose or perform it, so it should be 2, 1, 4, 3. Let's take up the next one. See, in this, you can't have such a belief in the harmony. Such a belief means he has already talked about some belief, then only he can say such a belief, otherwise he can't say. So number 1 cannot be the first sentence, number 2 cannot be the first sentence. These parts all fit together. What parts? We don't know what these refer to. It's incorrect. We cannot have these parts. So 1 and 2 cannot be the first sentence. Now, it is an example of ancient belief system called teleology. What is an example? We don't know what it refers to. So 1, 2, and 4 cannot be the first sentence. The first sentence has to be then number 3. Historically, the notion of balance of nature is part observational, part metaphysical, and not scientific in any way. After 3, you go for number 4. Why? Because you don't have a belief or a part mentioned in number 3. You don't have any reference to that. You say it is an example of ancient belief system called teleology. It is an example, that is the notion of balance of nature is part observational, part. Ancient teleology, the notion that what we call nature as a predetermined destiny associated with its component parts. To give you an example of teleology, premature teleology, and then component parts. Now these parts, number 2, these parts refer to the component part. So it should be 3, 4, 2, and then again you have such a belief, that is you have 3, 4, 2, 1. And now let's move on to another exercise, that is you have one passage and you have 4 alternate summaries. You have to choose the best summary. Now you have a word here, autapomorphy. Now autapomorphy means any shared trait. You see, any trait or any characteristics which differentiates you from others. For instance, language, you see, is a autapomorphic because only human beings, Homo sapiens, have language. What do you mean by that? You say, well, the animal talks in its language. No, it doesn't talk in its language. they have what you call stereotype noises. They can make only noise. So if you go through the passage carefully, there are so many things involved, you see, with language. For instance, he says that language crucially draws on aspects of cognition that are long established in primate lineage, such as memory. The language faculty as a whole comprises more than just the uniquely linguistic features. Yes, we talk about the universal grammar, you see. What he's saying here is in our cerebral cortex, you see, right in our minds, in our memories, the entire grammar, you see, of a language is built. You speak Hindi, I speak Hindi, all of us speak Hindi. Are we taught all that grammar and everything at home? But we speak grammatically correct Hindi, you see, because the universal grammar of that language is inbuilt, you see, in our brains. It is inbuilt in our ancestors' brain, and it has been handed over that way, you see. So it's not something that is learned. You see, you learn the grammar of a language, second language. If you're learning French, like English or German or some other language, you have to learn the grammar there. Your own language, you don't have that. Even when you learn a second language, sometimes you learn one rule and then you are able to generate so many sentences based on that rule. How? So that is what works there, you see. It's more than just the linguistic what do you call features, as they say. You've got so many things there. So if you look at these options here, language is derived trait found only in humans, has evolved over the times and involves memory. That is a very simplified, trivial way of saying things. Language is a distinctively human feature, as there is no evidence of the existence of language in any other species. He doesn't talk about the cognition or memory in this. He left that out. Language is evolved with linguistic features, building on features of cognition such as memory. Now the whole thing has come in number 3. So number 3 is the correct answer. Language is not a single uniform entity, but the end result of a long and complex process of linguistic evolution. Now that is a bad statement. It doesn't say anything about cognition, about memory, about the evolution. Number 3 is the correct option. Here you have, he says, social movement organizations often struggle to mobilize supporters from allied movements in their efforts to achieve critical mass. Organizations with hybrid identity, those whose organizational identities span the boundaries of 2 or more social issues or identities. That is, there may be organizations with pure, within quotes, pure identity means they are working towards one particular thing. But there may be organizations with a hybrid identity. That is, they have several aims, you see, several aims from different organizations. They have taken them, are vital to mobilizing these constituencies. And then he talks about the studies of 9/11 and so forth. He's giving you an example. And you must remember that in any summary, we have to omit all statistics and all examples, whether it is a summary of the kind that we have here, or a summary or a précis writing which involves 1/3 of the original. You are not supposed to include the statistics and or examples in your summary. So number 1 cannot be the correct option. Number 2 cannot be the correct option because it is a example, you see, involved in anti-war movement. And then if you look at number 4, organizations with hybrid identities are able to mobilize individuals with different points of view. That is the point he wants to make. So number 4 is the correct option. Movements that work towards social change often find it difficult to mobilize a critical mass of supporters. It's not the question of a debate whether they find it difficult. In fact, they're able to mobilize. So number 4 is the correct option. Let's look at the next passage here. Now he's talking about privacy challenged office workers may find it hard to believe, but open plan offices and cubicles were invented by architects and designers who thought that to break down the social walls that divide people, you had to break down the real walls too. Now, the point that is trying to make here is getting people together in office in one single room so that they can socialize and work together without much tension and they don't feel isolated. But then what has happened is several companies, you see, they took advantage of this by not allotting rooms to different employees under the pretext of socialization. These people, what they did was they just gave a room so that all of them can work in a room. So it was not something, a work of democratic ideology. In fact, they wanted to save space. So saying that you break the walls so that there is more equality and more socialization, that could be an argument. But then all these great companies and organizations, they were breaking the walls so that they can save space. They had their own economic, advantage over that. Number one, wall-free office spaces did not quite work out as desired, and therefore cubicles came into being. Is that the argument there? That cubicles came to being because of the wall-free office did not work? That's not the argument, and doesn't include the whole thing. So number one is not the correct option. Wall-free office spaces did not quite work out the way their utopian inventors intended, as they became tools for exploitation of labor. That is the main point. You see, the workers were exploited under the pretext of wall-free offices. So number two is the correct option. Number three says wall-free office spaces could have worked out the way the utopian inventors intended had companies cared for workers' satisfaction. But that is not the point here. He's just making a point, that's all. He's not debating, had those people did this or had those people did that. No, wall-free office spaces do not quite work out as companies don't believe in democratic ideology. Yes, they don't believe in democratic ideology, but then the point of exploitation is left out here. So number two includes all the points. So number two is the correct option. Now we come to exercise. A particularly interesting example of inference occurs in many single panel comics. He's talking about comics. You must have seen in newspapers that sometimes there are multiple panel comics. There are several panels you see, and in each panel there is a balloon. Somebody is speaking, there are boxes, right? It is the creator's participation and imagination that makes the single panel comic so engaging and so important. The third one, often the humor requires you to imagine what happened in the instant immediately before or immediately after the panel you're being shown. He takes up an interesting example, about the single panel comics, and he talks about the humor in it in the third sentence. And to get the joke, what you have got to do, it is as though the cartoonist devised a series of panels to tell the story and has chosen you only one, and typically not even the fun. Now, number 1, 3, 4, 5 addresses the reader or the listener. Number 1 is a general statement. Number 3, 4, and 5, they address the second person, you, the reader, the listener. So number two is about, the creator, the man who made comic, his imagination. We don't require that here. We can't adjust that here. So number two is the odd one out. Now let us look at this one. He says Socrates told us that the unexamined life is not worth living, and that know thyself is the path to true wisdom. Now, if you look at this, it suggests that you adopt an ancient rhetorical method favored by the likes of Julius Caesar, known as Iliism, or speaking about yourself in the third person. And people are prone to rumination. That is, rumination means deep thinking. Also often suffer from impaired decision making under pressure and are at a substantially increased risk of depression. People who think a lot. Simple rumination, the process of churning your concerns around your head, is not the way to achieve self-realization. The idea is that the small change in perspective can clear your emotional fog, allow you to see past your bias. If you look at this, 2, 3, 4, 5, they are talking about rumination, particularly rumination in the sense of Iliism. It's all about rumination, thinking deep. So number one is the odd one out, because number one talks about what Socrates said, what is the unexamined life is not living, and that to know thyself is the path to true wisdom. So number one doesn't get into the whole thing. Now we come to the last question, and here he says ocean plastic is problematic for a number of reasons, but primarily because marine animals eat. The danger of ocean plastic. The largest numerical proportion of ocean plastic falls in small sized fractions. And then he talks about, apart from clogging up the digestive tracts of marine life aside, it harms the digestive tract, it absorbs pollutants, and it is an environmental problem. He points out in number 4. Eating plastic has a number of negative consequences, that is retained in our intestine, then compared to normal food particles. So number 1, 3, 4, 5, they are all talking about the dangers of plastic, how it harms. But number 2, makes a statement: the largest numerical proportion of ocean plastic falls into small size fractions. We are not interested in that. That's not the point. So the correct answer is number 2.